Hello? All right, awesome. So my name is Dylan, and I would like to welcome you to the May 4th Task Force's Fall Forum, The Line in Force, How Much is Too Much. Tonight, we're here to talk about force. And force is nothing new. It's been used since the beginning of time, and use is both necessary and excessive in measure. We've seen both the good and the bad sides of force. Necessary force has saved the lives of many throughout history as a preventative measure. But we've also seen force right here in Kent, on May 3rd and 4th, when students were stabbed and shot. What has changed over time is not force, but how we see it. The internet and social media are quick to not only show us these situations, but also create widespread public judgment from the comfort of home. Context is the most important factor when deciding if force used was justified, and it seems to be the factor most easily stripped away. Tonight, we hope to educate. We hope that we can have our concerns answered and our fears of a world that every day appears more and more violent quelled. We also hope to understand the other side of the situation, to gain perspective of those who engage in these situations not because they are violent in nature, but simply because it is what is needed for them to stay alive. Hopefully, this will give us some understanding and be the first step toward making the world we live in a place where force is ultimately unnecessary. So if I can have our panelists just go down the line and give a short introduction of who you are and maybe what group you represent or what experience you have.
Hi, my name is Tori Swarm. I'm a senior here, undergrad, majoring in conflict management. I'm here representing Student Peace Alliance. So let's see who I am here, I guess. Okay.
My name is Matthew Thompson. I'm a senior sport administration major, minor in business. But I'm the president of Black United Students, so that's the organization I'm representing tonight.
I'm Michael Scott. I'm a 40-year law enforcement veteran. I retired about 10 years ago. I currently teach at Kent State University. I have a master's degree in criminal justice. I'm ABD PhD in criminal justice. I've served in just about every position there is in law enforcement. I served on the Governor's Task Force in Missouri back in the 1980s. I served on the Governor's Task Force in Florida in the 1990s for the use of excessive force in police. My dissertation topic is excessive use of force by police and learning theory. I've commanded a major case squad, commanded the narcotics investigation squad. I was a consultant for the Missouri Department of Corrections. I commanded the internal affairs divisions for the Tri-County area in St. Louis County and its environs. And that's probably all I've got to say for now. It's nice to be here. I'm glad to see that my class is here. Guys, pay attention, take notes. It'll be something from your exam.
Well, that was a distinguished way of putting it, wasn't it? My name's Ron Snyder. I'm married, father of 4 girls and stepfather of 4 boys, grandfather of 12, great-grandfather, and the grandfather of 4 KSU graduates and 1 son that's graduate. I have 17 years of military experience in the U.S. Army, ending as a captain, commanding 194 people in an infantry rifle company. I have 22 years of law enforcement experience, mostly as an investigator of homicides, rapes, robberies, murders, excuse me. Directly involved in 6 lethal force incidences, was slightly wounded once by, I always say by accident, because it was a domestic dispute. I made a mistake and didn't pay attention like I should have. I have 24 years of technical supervision and fraud investigation for a large insurance company, and I'm glad to be here tonight. Thank you.
My name is Ashley Manning. I'm the president of the May 4th Task Force, and that's the group I'm representing today.
Gary Daniels, I'm the chief lobbyist for the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. I'm a Kent State graduate, so it's nice to be back here at Kent once again at this type of event. Chief lobbyist is my current position. I've bounced around for about 16 years within the ACLU, legal department investigations, running our regional office in Columbus, doing media work, and when I'm not seeing how the sausage is being made in Columbus, they send me out to do events like this and talk about various issues. It's my second time working for the ACLU. In between, I worked in New York City for a few years, working for the Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Coalition Against Censorship. So, yeah, this is pretty much since I left Kent, this is what I've been doing, and it's what I wanted to do. So, it's nice to see when you graduate college, sometimes things turn out the way you want. And thanks for being here.
All right, so the format of our panel is we're going to ask a general question and go down the line and have each panelist answer it in hopes that we can learn a little bit about the use of force tonight. So our first question is, what is your personal definition of excessive force? Where do you draw the line between too little and too much?
For me personally, I think excessive force is anything that you can classify as unnecessary. So if somebody's coming at me, I push you away. I need to do that to get the person away. Did I need to throw you on the ground and start hitting you? No. So anything that is considered unnecessary in the situation. So it really depends on the situation you're facing, which is why I think it's so hard to define like an overarching one. So you have to go with what you personally believe it is. Too little is something where you don't get across what you need to get across. But if you look at anything, you could find a way to do it without much force. It's what the practice of nonviolence is, which is what Student Peace Alliance does a lot of work with. So you could find a way to go about getting your point without much force at all. It just is a matter of looking at it from a different angle. So, but too much is anything that is not necessary. So that's how I would define those and express that.
Excessive force, my personal definition, would also toe the line of necessity, would go case by case. I'm not for, killing, so I would draw the line at too much would be, a lot of times when it's ended in murder. I think Eric Gardner, his situation was too much. I would say Michael Brown, that situation was too much, and the list goes on. So I would draw the line more or less when it's just like there isn't any clarity onto why the situation ended in specifically murder, but in a situation where someone is terribly harmed. That's where I would draw the line. Too little, that's up to the discretion of the officer. I guess too much would be as well, but sometimes that discretion can be skewed, and I guess we'll talk about that more later.
There are actually many definitions of excessive force, and it wasn't until about 10 or 15 years ago where an actual continuum was developed, and that continuum happens to be my personal explanation of excessive force, or rather use of force. There's a tendency to say excessive when discussing police use of force, and that's a knee-jerk reaction because that assumes that all force is excessive. I don't see it that way. If you look at the use of force continuum, the very first step is officer presence, and that's the very presence of a police officer can often settle down a hot situation. If that doesn't work, the next is loud verbal commands. My classes heard me do that, and I won't do that here. Loud verbal commands often settle down a situation. Failing that, it's open hand technique. That's where you actually place your hand on someone in an attempt to stop them from doing whatever it is they're doing. The fourth step, as most of you know, is the use of oleoresin capsicum, which is basically, it comes from tacos, taco sauce, and that will often stop a subject or slow a subject down. There's also tear gas, which isn't used nearly as much, and there are tasers. All of these intermediate weapons enjoy good reputations in the media, but bad reputations among the police. They only work about half the time. And of course, finally, you have deadly force. Back in the early 70s, before 1977, police officers in the United States were allowed to shoot anybody, a felon, that ran from them. They were allowed to shoot them just because they were a felon. They had reasonable grounds to believe they were a felon. There's a court case, Tennessee versus Garner, that came about wherein the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that anymore. You have to be able to articulate that the individual presented a clear and present danger to yourself and or the community. So if an officer can articulate that the individual has in fact done that, let's say for example, the individual has just committed an armed robbery or a felony of any kind, or if the individual attacks the officer, a combination of both would give the officer reason to use deadly force if he had no other alternatives. Too little force, and that results in you, the officer, getting hurt. And it also puts the citizenry at great risk, because if the officer can't control the situation and the officer is hurt, then that individual is out among the community and he can hurt them. That's all I have.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say that I completely agree with the way he's expressed it, and it's pretty straightforward in steps. But I prepared, after thinking about this question, what I feel is excessive force, and having seen it a number of times. Excessive force is a purposeful use of a greater force than necessary to overcome the resistance or assault of an unlawful individual. That's the police definition. That's how they trained us. However, the amount of force to be used can only be judged by the officer applying the force. What would be excessive force to him might not fit your particular circumstance if you were faced with the same situation. And to judge that effective force, the officer has to make that decision. And it should be immediate and overwhelming force in order to resist the attack. Because when the officers usually resort to force, that means that somebody's going to go to jail. That's usually the bottom line. And he has to come across with enough force to get that person into the handcuffs. He needs to end the incident as quickly as possible. If he doesn't, those things can result in riots. And then it becomes more, people lose their lives, and so on. Where do you draw the line? Obviously, employing too little force and failing to overcome resistance or stop the attack may well result in the personal death or injury of the officers. It's that fine line that must be walked on by the law enforcement officer when he's dealing with those situations. Now, these things have evolved over the last 40 years, at least. When I first was sworn in as an officer in about 1963, I was given a badge, had to buy my own gun, and basically what I was told is win the fight and don't get hurt. But now, as you go down through the years, various things occur. Now there's guidelines in place, and hopefully, and I've seen it work too, hopefully it continues to work and that the excessive force doesn't become a huge issue.
For me, I think my personal definition of excessive force is, I think whenever someone is using their position of power as a means to justify infringing upon someone else's civil liberties and civil rights. Like in the instance of May 4th, 1970, I think a lot of the justification for bringing in the Guard in the first place was basically to keep the campus under control, and that the protesters were getting out of control. Which I think is fine, because, you know, then they did have the police there, but then they decided to bring in these armed guards and throw tear gas at the protesters, and then, of course, as we know, on the day of May 4th, actually have loaded guns and shoot the protesters. And I think when you're doing that as a way to infringe upon someone's freedom of speech, and you're using that force to do that, then I think that's where it becomes too much. In terms of drawing the line between too little and too much, I think that too little would constitute as when you are putting citizens in danger and you're not doing your job, which is to serve and protect, and you're not doing that. And then I think that the same can also be said for too much. So I think that you have to find kind of a balance between those two.
I don't have anything particularly enlightening to add to the definitions everybody here is given. I think it's clear that excessive force is when the police force is out of proportion to what it is that they're trying to control. I'm glad, sort of glad that Professor Scott brought up use of continuum of force, because I was going to talk about that, but he handled it, I think, in a way that illustrates to everybody that, at least in the ACLU perspective, as much as we can make objective about this, that is where you have police departments across the country using the same general guidelines as to when they can use force. Of course, we don't want people getting tasered for jaywalking or getting shot for speeding or anything like that. So it's been that over the years, this use of force continuum that has developed has been extremely helpful with regard to law enforcement. It provides clear guidelines to law enforcement as to what's appropriate and what's not. And then when new technologies arise, for instance, tasers are pretty new at this point still with regard to law enforcement, and they find a place on that use of force continuum, and that's how it always should be with police and with that introduction of new technologies. Because there will be new technologies related to law enforcement that will pop up in the future that we haven't even thought about yet. And as a bare minimum standard, as long as we can get them on a use of force continuum with a police department or law enforcement agency, that's what we want as far as minimum standards.
All right, so this next question is only for our previous experienced law enforcement professionals, so that would be Mr. Scott and Mr. Snyder. And I know you both talked a little bit about the guidelines presented to you, but what were the guidelines on force that you were given when you started law enforcement? And also, the first time you had to use force, did you have any assumptions about the situation that you found to be incorrect? And what are some things that civilians might not understand about such encounters?
Guidelines. Well, my very first day as a commissioning police officer was August 27th, 1966, and there were no guidelines except don't get hurt. Arrest who you're going to arrest, try not to kill them, don't get hurt. That was basically what it was. My very first encounter with an individual where I had to use force was with a woman who was completely, absolutely out of control, screaming, spitting, biting. The problem that I had as a very, very young, just barely started shaving officer was I had been taught my entire life by my family, my culture, that you don't hit women. It's just not the right thing to do. You don't do it. So my partner is wrestling with this screaming woman, and he is screaming at me, help me, help me, help me. So all of a sudden, I find myself in a situation where I'm wrestling a woman, and that went completely against my brain, completely against everything I'd ever learned. And then finally, back in those days, we didn't have anything like oleoresin resin capsicum. We didn't have pepper spray. We didn't have tear gas. And we didn't have PR-24 clubs. We had nightsticks. And you could use them, or you could use your fists. And as it turned out, I ended up having to use my fists to get this lady on her stomach and her hands behind her back, and it took two of us. And there were a lot of people around. This happened at a very busy intersection. There were a lot of people around. And the only thing that I can remember, and it's one of those things I've never forgotten, is I hit a woman. What would my mother think? That has haunted me all of these years. But in retrospect, I understand that it was absolutely necessary. I had no choice. Otherwise, we would have been hurt, and she would have been hurt even more because there were other officers on the way.
Well, my first experience, first of all, was quite a foray. I went on a call of a domestic neighborhood problem, and usually that's negotiation, talking to the people, and making them all go home. On this particular time, you have to take yourself back to 1963. There was no breathalyzers. There was really no liquor regulation. You bought it everywhere. And people drank like a fish and drove and had terrible accidents. There was road hazards that killed them. So when you had a neighborhood dispute with liquor involved, you just knew full well that it was going to be a fight. And sure enough, we approached the house, and the guy throws his girlfriend out the second floor window. Long way, unconscious. And then he swings a baseball bat and says, "I'm not going to jail." It was actually right out here in Springfield Township in Summit County. So, of course, they call an ambulance and do the usual things, but that guy's going to go to jail. We don't have tear gas. We don't have the modern equipment that you have here. We didn't even have bulletproof vests. We don't know if he has guns. We don't know anything about this guy. No computers that day to find out what his criminal history was. So we go in flat. And the only weapons we have is a gun, and this is what police carry. Right?
I haven't seen one of those in a long
I know,
time.
it's an antique.
Yes, it is.
But it wasn't an antique when I first got it.
Yeah.
So you wade in, this has got a lead ball in the front of it. Then you hit the guy in the head so many times as you need to suppress him. After you get him down, you suppress him and hope that you didn't fracture his skull. You put him in the handcuffs and take him off to jail, sometimes with a stop at the hospital. In this case, it was Akron City on the way. But you had to use force, and some people, they're just not going to go easy. And that's when you have to use force. Now today, there's tons of tools available. Instead of having 2 or 3 guys try to get this person, you can get a whole squad there, 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 or however many people you need to help suppress this individual, hopefully without getting them hurt.
Next question is for all the panelists. National attention has recently been turned to multiple incidents of racially motivated police violence over the past several months. Many commentators have observed that in many circumstances, officers assume the criminality of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly of young black males. What do you think accounts for this, and how might we go about addressing this problem?
Racism is a big thing that's going to account for this. The fact that people say, oh, it's not an issue anymore, and it really is. Now, I know I personally can't say a whole lot on this topic because I'm not a young black person. I'm not a minority. I'm not a person of color, so I can't say exactly how this plays out or really say much on this topic because I'm not part of that community. And so speaking on it, I don't really have a right to do that. But I think that one big thing that does play into why we're talking about it now is these guys. Our open access to technology nowadays, people are more apt to videotape what's going on, comment about what's happening around them, and really spread what's going on. It's a big thing with any movement is that the more open access we have to media and technology and the more we talk about it, the more we can cover it and learn more about the topics.
Well, I do have some ideas about this question. I just want to put the caveat out there that I'm just one black male, so I don't want to speak on behalf of all. I know sometimes that gets confused, so I just want to make that point early on. What I do think accounts for this is the implicit messages and implicit bias that we get from a young age. The fact that the idea that black lives are in a sense of, as far as ranking and as far as capitalism is concerned, aren't as worth as much as other lives, as much as white lives. And this is through a whole host of other things, that through images and through media and through just regular teachings and through not addressing racism ever in your entire education, in the American education system. I think all of those account for instances like this. How do we go about addressing this problem is acknowledging the fact that there are people around us that we know nothing about, and acknowledging the fact that since we have that issue, other things are coupled with that. So what are those things? You have no knowledge about this person. You have no value for this person's life. You have no idea of this person's experience, and your whole basis on who they are is filled with stereotypes that make you feel like they're an aggressor. and they're always trying to end your life. As far as tangible or concrete solutions, that's the million-dollar question. I can't answer that particularly, but I would definitely say it's opening our view and stop looking at things always so myopically, and understanding that the person next to us is worth, something. Life is priceless, but if we have to put a price on it, it's worth something.
I'd like to revisit the first sentence of the question. And I quote, "National attention has recently been turned to multiple incidents of racially motivated police violence over the past several months." I don't know what that is. That's an assumption that is not in evidence. The Ferguson case is still being decided by the grand jury. In St. Louis, the incident occurred just a couple of weeks ago. A black man shot at a police officer. The police officer had every reason and absolutely certainly had cause to shoot back to protect himself. So I think that's one of the problems. The assumption is made that because a white police officer kills a black man, it has to be a racially motivated crime. And I think that's one of our biggest problems. And I think part of this is driven by the media, in particular the 24/7 media, CNN, MSNBC, and it's also driven by the race baiters. These are the individuals who go out in the community and stir up problems where there are no problems, where they point the finger at the police and say, it's the police that did this, and the only reason this person was shot and killed is because he or she was black. Well, I'm not going to say that this doesn't happen. That would be disingenuous, because of course it happens. The police are recruited from us. The police are recruited from society. And if you look at society, you will find people that are racists. You will find people that hate children. You will find people that love animals but hate cats. Police are recruited from us. There is no amount of psychological testing or other testing or any pre-employment screening we can do that will weed out every single element of the human psyche. It's just impossible. Human behavior is human behavior. So, again, getting back to the main question, when you say things that national attention has been turned to multiple instances of racially motivated police violence over the past several months, what do? You poison your audience immediately, and you paint all the police with a broad brush of racism. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are 850,000 police officers in this country. Is it right to say every single one of them is a racist? Of course not. Of course not. That's common sense. So once we remove these assumptions, that's step one in the right direction. Once we understand that racism goes both ways, and it does, there are black people that don't like police, there are Hispanic people that don't like police, there are police that don't like black people, or Hispanic people, or Asian people. There are police that don't like white people. Racism exists. It doesn't mean that everyone in the business of law enforcement, or everyone who lives in a specific neighborhood, say Ferguson, Missouri, or Florissant, Missouri, or St. Louis, Missouri, are racists. It's wrong to say that. And you take a step back when you make that assumption that every law enforcement involved shooting against a person of color is racially motivated. And so far as what can you do about it? The only saving grace, the only thing I can think of, and this started in the 1980s, is community-oriented policing. But both sides have to commit. Law enforcement has to commit. They can't just pay lip service to it and say, well, we're just going to initiate community law enforcement policing, and we're going to go out among the community because Uncle Sam's given us all kinds of federal dollars to do so. And the community can't say, well, we're going to go and we're going to meet the police and we're going to get together with them so that we can convince them they need to stop writing so many traffic tickets. It has to be a commitment. It has to be a commitment on the part of the administration and trickle down through the entire department. It has to be a commitment in the community. People need to get together. It's a lack of communication. That's why people are dying. And that has to stop. The lines of communication must be opened.
To clarify, we are not intending to imply that every situation between two people of different races that uses force is racism. And we understand if the question could be read as that, and we apologize. We also do not want to imply that racism only exists between black and white people, because there are many forms of racism. but we do think that when situations occur where force is used and it is racially motivated, it is a serious problem. Mr. Snyder, do you want to?
Yes. First of all, I think he stated it very well, especially from administrative and teaching standpoint. The one thing I found out through the years is the media will spin just about anything. I have to think, as we speak, the character and the reliability of the national media right now is really low in my eyes, because they've learned how to spin these things in such a way that it changes the whole complexion of a particular incident. Just to give you an example, Al Sharpton, certainly, he's not one of my favorite people, but he certainly has done some good. However, to point out to you, he got the media to spend a whole bunch of things with regards to the Tawana Brawley case. It was a rape case, it was all a hoax. He was after the money. Many of these national people, it never happened, but many of the national people that help stir this stuff up, they're after the bucks that go with that. Especially if they get their, as they say, the camel's nose under the tent and get a settlement, then they declare it a win. It may just be some payoff to make things go away by an insurance company. But nevertheless, these things are out there. I listened to something that come up last night, and some of this can even be the police fault. They use such words as toys for a weapon. What kind of toys did you buy at the store, you know? Well, maybe he bought a weapon of some kind. Or flash bang. Well, that's a big trigger. That's when the dope squad throws that in the house in order to redirect the attention of a guy with possibly a machine gun, sawed-off shotgun, and other things that intends to kill anybody trying to raid his dope stash. Just two little things. And all in all, I would say that right now, based on what I can glean from good, reliable information, you'll probably see this Ferguson thing actually go away, because the physical evidence is starting to come in, and if it's the way it seems to be, no, I doubt if anybody gets indicted for anything. And then pretty soon, after it all quiets down and the threats all go away, somebody will probably file a lawsuit. But I don't think much will come of it. Could be wrong, but that's the way it looks right now.
I would agree with what Tori said. Was it Tori?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm obviously not a person of color, so I feel like I can't accurately address this topic, but I will say that I think what accounts for racially motivated police violence would be the fact that this country does have a long-standing history of racism, and a lot of the times we do not want to face this and recognize that we do have this history. And I think in terms of addressing this problem would simply just be educating ourselves and knowing that this does exist and understanding that.
I'm also not a person of color, but let me take a crack at this. This isn't just assumptions, and this isn't just media. This is a justice system that works for some people and doesn't work for others. The statistics aren't perfect, but where we can get racial profiling statistics out of various cities, whether it's the ACLU, whether it's academics, whether it's people as a result of a lawsuit, and sometimes the government and police getting those numbers and crunching themselves. This is what we know. Not to pick on any particular police department or individual, but this is pretty much the same no matter where you go in this country. Take me as an example. We'll talk about any random black man out there. Between the two of us, he's more likely to get stopped by police. He's more likely to get searched by police. He's more likely to get cited by police. He's more likely to get arrested by police. And if we commit the same crime and go to court, he will do more time in prison than I will do. Those are facts. It's not assumption, that's not being driven by the media. This is when you take the numbers and crunch them. And it is a very real problem. We've got an overcrowded prison system here in Ohio that's been overcrowded for 20 years. That's made up of 60% white folks and 40% people of color, even though people of color in this state make up, I don't know what the exact numbers are these days, but it's usually been traditionally somewhere around 13, 14%, somewhere around there. This is a very real problem for an awful lot of people. I could go on and on about this. I know Dylan wants us to limit our answers to a few minutes, but when we get to the solution part of it, I wish I had all the solutions and not any one single thing is going to work. But what would help tremendously is to totally end the war on drugs, or like what I like to call the war on some drugs, and think about drugs and addiction as a public health matter, because you know what, for 35 years we've tried to arrest, convict, and incarcerate our way out of this problem, and by all objective measurements, it has been an absolute and abysmal failure. You can get all the same drugs that you could 35 years ago now, and in many cases they're cheaper than they were. We've been trying and beating our heads against the wall for 35 years doing this with an incredibly disproportionate effect on communities of color. It was only in Ohio, a bill that I helped work on as part of the ACLU up until a few years ago. Just to give you one factor, the conviction rates, the sentencing rates rather, for crack versus cocaine, and those are the same drugs. They're both cocaine. But for crack, you had a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity here in Ohio and at the federal level. What communities tend to use crack more? The black community. What communities tend to use cocaine more? The white community. But we had a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity that luckily now, as a result of House Bill 86 here in Ohio, has been taken care of, at least in the last few years. But there's a whole lot of problems with this. I mean, we could talk about this issue forever, but I would submit if the same types of statistics were going on with the white community here in Ohio or Kent or the United States, people would be making an awful lot of more noise about it than they are right now. And that's what we need to do, make a whole lot more noise about this problem.
Thank you. The next question, is psychological screening an effective method of preventing abuses of power? Or are abuses of power a natural reaction to being placed in the high-stress situation of law enforcement? And this is an opinionated question. We realize that none of you are psychologists or able to analyze this from a professional standpoint.
Okay, I mean, screening for things is always helpful to an extent, but you can never pinpoint exactly how people are going to respond when under a stressful situation. So, if you screen someone and you say, well, you have this, this, and this, or you have biases towards this, this, and this, it's like, okay, you can keep that in mind. So it could be helpful in, well, when you want to put them in a certain situation, make sure we avoid these ones compared to other ones. But when somebody's under stress, we all react differently. We all have our fight or flight kick in, and we respond to that. So even if we screen, it can be helpful. I'm not going to say that, personally I believe it could help a bit, but to a certain extent, depending how much pressure you put on them, people will crack eventually. And in a law enforcement position, I'm not experienced in this, but any position of power, if you give somebody that power, you can act differently. Some people know how to handle that. Just look at customer service jobs. If you've worked one, you know that somebody's going to come in and yell at you immediately for something that they're completely out of line for. And that's just a small bit of power telling them, you're a customer, so you're always right. Some people use it and abuse it. They can't even handle that. So, you take that same person, you give them even more power. What's to say that they're not going to, abuse that as well? So, can screening help? Yes. Is it, solution to everything? No.
I think psychological screening can be effective. I think it should be done to anybody that you're going to put a gun in their hand and say, go out there and clean up the streets. I think you should definitely make sure they're psychologically fit before you send them out to do that duty. Is abuse of power a natural reaction to being placed in high-stress situations with law enforcement? That's a tough question. I think we have to look at look at it more on a grand scale. I don't know that being in a high stress situation, that abusing power is a natural inclination, but I think going back to just implicit bias and what that can do on a grand scale is what we should look at. The idea that, just going back to the previous question, that black males are dangerous, that black males are aggressive, I think that has to be looked at. I think our idea of other people causes us to be aggressive and abuse power in situations where we feel like our power may be limited or may be threatened by the person that, as a police officer, I'm going after. I think in that situation, it may be a natural inclination because my natural reaction is, I have to get this person on the ground. So how do I do that? Well, in this situation, I have to use my gun. That's a tough question, but a relevant one. Can we come back to it? Is that possible?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, go back to it.
There is actually a psychological screening tool that's used by a majority of law enforcement agencies across the country, and it's called the Minnesota Multi-Phase Psychological Instrument, MMPI for short. It's 700 questions, bizarre questions, life questions. You can't really fail it. There are 3 results. There's a low risk, medium risk, and a high risk as a law enforcement or as a potential law enforcement officer. If you score in the medium or high risk category, you are interviewed by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. The larger departments have them on staff, smaller departments, and by the way, 87% of all law enforcement agencies in the United States have less than 25 members. Less than 25 members. So what we're talking about here primarily are the larger departments. Anyway, is this an effective tool? I don't know. Is it a tool? Yes. Can it prevent some people from putting on a badge and a gun that shouldn't be wearing a badge or carrying a gun? Absolutely. So in that respect, it's a valuable tool. How many are caught by the use of this tool and other tools, such as polygraph, background investigation, oral interviews? We don't really know, because it's not until there has been some abuse when we learn that this person should never have had a badge and a gun. There's a syndrome called the Dirty Harry syndrome, where the end justifies the means, and that's where the officer or the individual says, okay, I need to do this to accomplish this, even if this is wrong or against the law. I am the power, I have this influence, I can do this, because it's the right thing to do, even if it's not the lawful thing to do. And what this young man, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, what Matthew was trying to say here, I can see the struggle, and I can understand the struggle, because the power is implicit in the badge. The power is implicit in the authority. It's not until that power rises to the level of complete control, regardless of the laws of our society, is there a problem. When that happens, when the officer decides, the officer or officers, and there have been all sorts of investigations, all sorts of corruption within law enforcement, when they decide that they are higher than the law because they carry a badge and they wear a gun, then there's a problem. And those problems have to be addressed. The young lady at the end here, she brought up a great point, fight or flight. If you Ron here and I have been in those situations. When you're in a firefight, when you're in a situation where somebody is shooting at you, where somebody is really intent on killing you, before they go home at the end of the day, your goal is to be the one that goes home at the end of the day. And you're scared to death. You're terrified. It's terror. Sometimes it just lasts a split second, but you know in those split seconds of terror that you have a decision to make. You must make a decision that takes doctors, lawyers, judges, days, weeks, months, sometimes years to make. You have to make that decision. And that's a tremendous burden. It's a tremendous burden. And before I give up, I just want to, the gentleman here, I could not agree more about the war on drugs. It is the greatest legislative disaster to hit this country since the Volstead Act was signed in 1919, prohibition. An absolute disaster. People are going to jail, we're going to jail, felonies, going to the penitentiary for possession of marijuana, which is now legal in 2 states. It is an embarrassment. We are an embarrassment to the world. And why our politicians don't get together, what am I saying? Politicians getting together? What a novel idea. So anyway, why they don't get together and get rid of this, it is just beyond me. Thank you. I'll meet my
Well, I think psychological testing is just a start in the whole process. My department went to the MMPI back in 1973. It was fairly new then, but it worked. What it did, it helped us to move on to the next phase. I don't think that you can totally rely on psychological testing by any means. You need to do the background investigation. You need to go out and knock on his neighbor's doors. What do you think of this guy? You know? And you get all of that information together. It's just like doing a top secret clearance in the military. You go out, you talk to people, you talk to the family, you talk to everybody, you do the background investigation. Has he ever been arrested for even a minor misdemeanor? Did he get redirected from something that he got in trouble with in college? All of that stuff. And after a while, when you put it all together, you get a pretty good idea of what the individual candidate is all about. But it doesn't end there. It goes on to when he's in his training classes and so on like that there. I think somebody addressed the thing about whether or not you could tell whether somebody's just power hungry or not. That's a really hard one to come up with until you see them under fire. Personally, I've never been absolutely calm when I've come under fire. It scares the tar out of you for a few minutes, and then you start thinking clearly, and then you're starting to think survival. Then you're starting to think, okay, we can fix this situation. And you go on about your business. But some people will get heavy-handed right at the very beginning. And sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not. But I think the police agencies are working to the end where they try to get the very best candidates possible. Not every area of the country is blessed like we are in this area of the country, where we can get pretty good qualified candidates. You go to the south or out toward the west, some of those places, you don't have a lot of places to recruit from of high quality candidates. So if you're in the middle of Arkansas and you have a confrontation with an officer, the last I heard, you better watch out because he'll resolve it in his favor every time, and it might not be pretty at the end. So you got to look at where you are in the United States when all that happens. The war on drugs. We were fighting drugs for years and years and years, and still doing it. I don't know what the solutions are, but my memory goes back to a dope deal that went sour out here just south of the university. We had an undercover guy buying about 18 sacks of marijuana from a guy the previous week. Had a sawed-off shotgun when they did the first deal, and the undercover guy thought he was going for the shotgun. Turned out there was none, and he killed him. Of course, we had a march on the courthouse and all that kind of thing. Shouldn't have happened. I mean, there was no reason for that to happen other than the fact that the circumstances caused that to happen. The undercover guy had been shot at, he'd been hit once down in Youngstown, so he wasn't going to let any of that happen again. Those things happen. The rest of the other 3 guys involved in the deal went to the penitentiary, but nevertheless, a life was lost, and it shouldn't have been. And that'll happen more. It could happen tomorrow morning in Akron or in this county, who knows? Because there's huge amounts of dope out there. Huge. I mean, you have no idea unless you are part of that action.
I would say that psychological screening is effective in weeding out certain people initially, but I think that the fact of the matter is that power does change people. And of course, not every law enforcement officer this will happen for, but I think for a lot of people, whenever they're in some kind of position of power, I think that a lot begin to think that what they consider moral or what isn't moral to them becomes somehow true for all people because they are in this position of power and they have say over these kinds of things. So I think that's when you have cases of abuses of power and things like that. So I don't think that any amount of psychological screening could prevent that. So I think that you have to go deeper and try other methods, which I'm sure that we'll talk about later on.
Dylan, I'd like to say I enjoy sitting on the end here because then it just gives me an opportunity to hear everybody else and then weigh in. And all I'm going to say is, look, I think everybody collectively here gave very thoughtful responses on this. So what I was going to say, and everybody has already said it, is in the psychological screening and psychiatry and all that fall outside certainly my expertise in the ACLU is a policy issue, but recognizing it can be an effective tool for somebody, I think, for some people is right on, but it can't be the only tool. And I've had a hand in hiring and firing people in the past in a variety of jobs, and doesn't matter what job it is. There's just sometimes, I've known law students who have impeccable legal research skills, and they're incredibly smart and they're incredibly intelligent, but geez, I don't know how they're ever going to make it as lawyers because, for instance, they don't have any people skills. And so, with police work, I think an awful lot goes into, you're not just enforcing the law, but sometimes you're a referee and sometimes you're a psychologist and sometimes you're this and sometimes you're that. And so I think for psychological screening, it certainly has its place. I don't think it's the end-all be-all, and I don't think anybody on this panel thinks so. And it's possible that further screening over the course of an officer's career, perhaps that would be useful. But I think what we recognize here is the unfortunate fact that usually when you find out that somebody is no good as a police officer whatsoever and should not have a badge or gun, you're finding that out after it's too late. And I don't know that there's a perfect solution for how you do that. None of us are ever going to bat 1,000 and get this right all of the time. But I think it has its place.
Matthew, did you have any closing thoughts on that?
Just real quick, definitely psychological screening can be effective, like you said, not the end all be all. I would question the training process. Do they put them in situations that can be high stressful with different type of people that look a different type of way, whatever that may be, but put them in those situations and see how they react, see what their natural reactions may be, and then adjust the training as need be.
Is that, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that for a moment.
Just quickly, preferably.
Yeah. Yeah. I have that reputation. The fact is, you can't put somebody in a fake high-stress situation because they know it's a fake high-stress situation, therefore it's not high-stress.
All right. We're going to ask one more question and then have a quick intermission. In recent occurrences where an officer severely violates policies involving force or abuse of power, the only punishment seems to be putting the officer on desk duty. Do you think that current punishment techniques of officers are effective? What would be some improvements that you might see made?
I mean, that's definitely assuming that the only thing is desk duty, which is, as far as the media puts it, the initial response. The first thing you do is you take that officer off the line, but we don't really follow up in what they're actually doing and what the full punishment is. So I can't really say much about it, but assuming that somebody's just put on desk duty, what are they doing with an officer? Are they asking them, are they debriefing them on everything that they did? If they fired their weapon, they need to, be talking to somebody like, this and this is what happened. You usually have some sort of talk with someone about, I have discharged my weapon, this is what happened, this is what I was thinking, what I was feeling, that kind of stuff. Obviously there needs to be some sort of process for it, but I can't really speak much to what that process should be. Because, I can say, in this situation, they should totally, they should fire that person, blah, blah, blah. But, it depends on what exactly is happening. And, putting them on desk duty for a certain amount of time might be necessary until you figure out what's going on. And then from there, they have to determine what the proper action is. So I can't really specify much on it because I don't know the exact process of what law enforcement does when it comes to that. So I've never been in that situation, being involved in law enforcement well enough to know what happens when they take somebody off the active line.
Yeah, I would say some improvements. I mean, obviously just taking them off putting them on desk duty shouldn't be the only technique. I don't think that alone is effective. I think some improvements will be to open up the process, let us see what's going on, and maybe get some community members involved in that process. Maybe it's readdressing their training, maybe it's a multitude of other things. But definitely opening that process up so we know what's going on behind the scenes. A lot of the time it gets real secret and we don't know what the ramifications are besides the case that's being blown up by the media, but what's really going on behind the scenes with Officer Darren Wilson and all the other officers. Opening that process and letting us have a say in what's going on, and maybe not even a say, but just a voice in what's going on and deliberation of some sort. I think that can improve the process.
Yeah, well, desk duty, what the young lady said, and Matthew here also, I agree basically with what they said. Desk duty assumes, in my opinion, guilt. Officers are taken off the street out of the line while an investigation is being conducted. Sometimes they're sent home. Matthew mentioned Officer Darren Wilson. He's in a place of safety. He's not sitting behind a desk somewhere as the investigation continues. And so far as the secrecy is concerned, the secrecy is the grand jury, and that's just a constitutional issue. That decision can't be made by the police. That's the government. That's the judiciary. That's how those decisions are made. They are made in secret. But then the evidence comes out and everybody gets to look at it. So far as community involvement and the punishment of a police officer, I can't agree with that. Police officers are innocent until proven guilty, just like everyone else. And it's the evidence that determines their guilt or innocence, not what somebody thinks, and not what somebody believes. It's the evidence that determines.
Well, first of all, disc duty is not any kind of punishment. You don't put people on disc duty to punish them. And it's like he said, it's to get them out of the line of fire, so to speak, because the media is trying to get to them. All kinds of things are going on. The officer himself has a lot of weight is bearing down on his shoulders. You don't want to throw him to the wolves, so to speak. So it's merely a place to get him out of the line and to get him away so that he's not attacked from all directions. Now, with regard to Matthew's statement in regards to community involvement, you have to understand that when these things happen, there's lawyers out there, thousands of them all over the United States. And they got one thing on their mind in one of these situations is, how can I get money out of these people? And so the insurance companies, or if they're self-insured, the city lawyers that handle this, they shut everybody up because the evidence will speak for itself in the end. And this is why, especially in deadly force, that any respectable prosecutor won't just walk out and say, hey, this is a justifiable homicide. He'll run it before the grand jury where he can subpoena all the information and everything. And the end result is, if the officer is guilty of some misstep, he will be punished for it. That punishment could be everything from a few days off to termination of his job. And this is the reason why in bigger departments today, the average officer makes between $60,000 and $90,000 a year very quick, because there's lots of responsibility, there's lots of risk, and he must be a person that's insurable. You let an officer make a mistake, and the insurance company for the organization will underwrite him, and he won't be able to be an officer anyway, whether they fire him or not. And it's a big, long story, takes too long to explain, and I'm sure he's about to say, move it on. So I'm moving it on to you.
I don't think that putting officers on desk duty is effective, obviously, and I would say that the problem with that is that it does not create accountability for what they've done, and it doesn't make it so that they recognize their abuse of power. It's simply that they're sorry that they got caught, and I have no qualms about saying that they will probably still abuse power next time, but they'll just be more careful about doing it. And then in that case, I think that instead of just putting them on desk duty, I think that the thing is that education is key in really letting an officer know why it was wrong that they abused power and how they abused that power is really what's going to make the difference. Because if they're just sitting there at their desk, they're not really thinking about what they've done. They're just kind of like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I'll have to be more careful next time.
Once again, I think people have summed it up very good, and I'm glad we got away from this issue that putting an officer on desk duty is perhaps just punishment. As is pointed out, it's a way to sort of diffuse the situation, get the officer off the street, and it also benefits the community. Because if what you've got is an officer where there's an allegation that they have seriously violated policies or used deadly force or what have you, yeah, we probably want that officer off the street for at least a little while, and then we'll allow due process to take over, whatever internal mechanisms there are with the police department, a grand jury, a court, what have you. So, there are some benefits to doing that, and beyond that, I'm not sure what other, if the person is found guilty of violating policies, or procedures or somebody's civil rights or somebody's civil liberties, that should obviously be dealt with, which I might as well segue into here. I mean, I don't think what any of us want is to paint all police officers with a broad brush and say they're all bad, they're all racist, this and that. I don't think anybody here is trying to do that, but I'm not a lawyer, but I have, as I like to joke around, I've been engaging in the unauthorized practice of law for 20 years now as part of the ACLU, and you know what? If we're not going to paint all officers with a big broad brush, we shouldn't do it with lawyers either. There's a lot of very good lawyers out there and there's bad lawyers out there. But if a police officer or a police department violates somebody's rights, they should be sued. And they should be made to pay, and there should be systemic reform in the police department as a result. I don't think lawyers should apologize or anything for going out and suing a police officer or a police department, because you can't really sue police officers. They have almost some pretty not ironclad immunity as an individual performing their function. You have to really go and sue the police department itself. But when police are violating people's rights, a lawsuit is not the entire answer out there. But yeah, get out there and sue them if they're violating people's rights. It's really the only thing that makes police departments listen.
All right, thank you for those thoughts. We are going to take a quick 5-minute, Mr. Schneider,
I just would like to add one more thing if I could.
Absolutely.
Only a few years ago in Ohio did it become the right thing to do was to give an officer representation right away, whether it was a justifiable homicide or what have you. He's entitled to a lawyer before he gives a statement. He gets the same rights as the average suspect does in anything. And because of that, it has advanced the professionalism of the police department a whole lot. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. We're going to have a very short 5-minute. All right, we're going to resume our questions. We have a few more scripted questions, and then we will, for a few minutes, open questions up to the audience. So if you have anything that you would like to know or you would like to ask, start thinking about that. So, to resume, a new method of monitoring law enforcement involves attaching cameras to the front of officers' clothing. Do you think this actually solves the problems of excessive force and abuse of authority, or is it just a Band-Aid on a larger issue?
I'm gonna have to say this would be a Band-Aid because I actually talked to somebody about it, and my friend was telling me, yeah, her aunt has to wear that camera on the front, and so you can see if they hit somebody or whatnot. And her aunt made a joke. Well, of course, you never use your hand because they'll see the marks on your knuckles. So you turn and you elbow. The camera can't see that, and you don't have anything on your hand. So when somebody says they hit me, you go, no, I didn't. I was like, well, look, she did. I'm like, just the fact that, she was so calm about saying that. I was like, huh. You also have a lot of issues, camera cam was broken, we didn't have it. The matter of actually turning it on, because it's not that hard to figure out how to, any sort of GoPro camera on-off switch right there. So, is it a Band-Aid or is it solving things? It's a Band-Aid. It's there to say, look, this is what they're doing. This is, this is what the officers see. But it can't cover everything that they're seeing and everything that's going on. So, it's just trying to, throw a tool at something and say that's, taking care of things.
I would also say it's a Band-Aid on a larger issue. I think something that we should look at as far as communities and having, racial bias in situations is having more officers that actually look like the communities they represent. I think that, growing up I went to high school in Southern Ohio. I grew up in Bedford, Ohio, which is right next to Southern, which is 95% black, something like that. At the time when I lived there. And there were 2 black officers, which to me is problematic when you have these implicit biases. I'm going to keep bringing that up because I think that's important. When you don't walk away with anything, I think that's something that we should all be looking into because we all experience it, even myself. But having that be a problem in the officer and policing process. So having our communities look more like our police force and having our police force look more like our communities and having people that are actually from those communities policing the areas. You bring in these outsiders that aren't familiar with kind of the ways of what's going on or the people they're actually supposed to be protecting and serving. And, you have issues in that process. So I think having more familiarity between the police force and the community could help this issue. But I do think a nice start would be having all officers wear a camera with their training.
I certainly think that all law enforcement officers should be required to wear cameras. The problem is the expense. Cities, counties, and governments would say today, oh, absolutely, we're going to put cameras on every one of our law enforcement officers because we don't want a situation like what happened in Ferguson until they realize how much it's going to cost. Then it might take a 1/4% sales tax increase, and then they're all this way next year. The fact is, it's a deterrent. If a law enforcement officer is inclined to use excessive force, and he has a camera watching him and watching what's going on, he's going to be less inclined. It's like the shoplifter who was looking at 2 stores. Store A has cameras. Store B doesn't have cameras. Which store do you think that person's going to steal from? Store B, the store without the cameras. The same with law enforcement. It's a deterrent. Is it going to solve the problem of excessive force and abuse of authority? That's historic. I don't think there is a solution. Can we minimize it? Yes. Can we improve on investigative methods? Yes. But can we solve it? No amount of cameras, no amount of policy, no amount of training is going to do that. But we can do the best that we can. And that's what we have to do.
Well, with the cameras, those citizens that are wishing and badgering the cities to provide those cameras, that's going to be a 2-way street. That's going to work for the officers also. Because when they go in to make an arrest, and that's all on tape, and that person acts up or doesn't comply and doesn't do what the officers told him to do in order to get the handcuffs on him, that's going to be evidence against him. And that's not going to sit well after a while. There's a lot of departments right now that has those cameras, and the officers seem to love them. They say that really takes all the questions out. All you have to do is play the tape, and his lawyer will get him to plead guilty to something. It may not be exactly what's charged because it's a plea bargaining world out there, but it certainly benefits the officer more than anything else. And yeah, it's just one of the many things that come along to make the police better than to restrict force and all that. I don't think that would apply too much. Because when they first came out with the Miranda warnings, you got a right to a lawyer and so on, all law enforcement would say, oh my goodness, this is going to kill us. We're never going to be able to arrest a crook. Well, guess what? Didn't have any effect whatsoever. Yeah, you got to give them their rights and everything, but still people have guilty minds. I don't think I ever had a guy that didn't say he was not guilty after he was in jail, but yet he confessed to every aspect of the crime. You know, it's one of those things. It's a two-way street. It'll work both ways, and hopefully all for the good.
I think I would say that it definitely is a band-aid over a larger issue. And I think that reason is that those cameras don't necessarily enforce the idea that it's wrong to abuse power, but just simply that it's wrong when you're being caught and not necessarily when you can't get caught. So, people are going to think, okay, it's okay as long as, I'm not wearing this, this video camera or whatever. So, yeah.
I don't know that we can exactly quantify how much of a help they would be, but the ACLU certainly advocates for body cameras on police. And we have an example, a real-life historical example of how this plays out. I've been doing this long enough. I was around when the dashboard cameras started to be used widespread, and we had these concerns. You had you had some police concerned about what would this mean for their daily job, and you had people like the ACLU, privacy advocates, saying, are these cameras and this footage going to be used to violate the privacy of people? And what we found out was a nice surprise that in many instances it actually helps prevent police conduct because the police are on camera. Just like Ron was saying, when you have it all on camera there, it both helps the citizens and it helps the police in many respects. Of course, not every single time. We're not going to do away with all of these problems with any particular technology or any particular solution. But I think, the jury is still out about because police wearing body cameras. I mean, this is a very new thing with regard to law enforcement, relatively speaking. So, you have an awful lot of departments, overwhelming majority that don't use this technology. So it remains to be seen how much effectiveness this will have. But one thing I do know, and I work an awful lot on privacy and law enforcement and surveillance issues as part of what I do at the State House. What I do know about technology is it always gets better, and it always gets cheaper, and therefore it always gets more widespread. So whereas with some departments, maybe cost is an issue with this, I think the more widespread we see these being adopted by police, the cost will go down and will get more widespread because I can't think of a single technology that's used by law enforcement where that hasn't occurred in the past, and I think we'll see the same with this one.
Can I add one thing very quickly?
Absolutely.
Let's make no mistake on these cameras. These aren't GoPros. These aren't $150 GoPros that you can turn on and off. The minimum they start with at $999, $1,000 per unit, and they're often operated remotely. Secondly, I can guarantee you it's against department policy to deactivate them if you can. It's the same with the dash cam. Police officers just can't turn them on and off at will. It's against department policy, and in some cases they cannot do that themselves. They're operated remotely, or the on-off switch is not available to the operator.
Just to add to that, I just reviewed a dash cam. These things will tell you the date, and time that they're recording. They're tamper-proof. The officer can't go in and edit it later on. Neither can a supervisor. Neither can his department. And there are usually one person in the department that can split them up by incident and that kind of thing. But there's not much else they can do. And the quality is very high quality. Not a GoPro. And I just want to add one more thing about technology. In Afghanistan and Iraq, we owned the night. And that equipment's going to be available pretty soon. Very expensive equipment. I would look for law enforcement to have a lot of the night vision devices in their hands in the next year or two. And maybe 3, 4, whatever it is. These you can see almost as good as in the nighttime as you can in the daytime. And of course, that's when the really slippery guys are out there operating, and they'll be able to zoom right in on them and have them on night vision devices. And it's a surveillance issue. But right now, it's as legal as can be, and I don't look for that to change because it's a tool in law enforcement's hands.
Thank you for that. I think those were both very important points that added to the question. On the other hand of this issue, should citizens be able to take images and video of police in action? Why or why not? And what kinds of consequences can this have for our communities and our democracy as a whole?
And unless somebody is obstructing justice in some way or getting in the way of what police are doing, I don't see any reason as to why you shouldn't be able to, know what's happening. It's not that hard nowadays to fly your camera, whatnot, get video images of what's going on around you. So when you point at the police force, I don't think there's anything should change in that aspect. It's like everything else, we're constantly have our faces in our phones, especially our generation. So, and then what kind of consequences can this have? I mean, we've already seen it. If something happens, it's up online already, been shared millions of times, and we already know what's going on. What leads to the 6 o'clock news? So just everything is shared so quickly that, can we differentiate between what actually is going on? Because we have, 10-second clip of what happened versus, the entire 2 minutes of what's going on. So it can give us a lot of false information because we don't have a premise for it, but it can also, in a sense, give us strictly information, which is what we kind of need.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we should be allowed to video and capture images. I think in situations where citizens sometimes feel powerless, it puts power back in the hands of the people. When we don't feel like we have it, especially when a police officer comes up and they may be trying to flex their power in certain situations. It also gives us a way to protect ourselves when, the story may get mixed up when it's being translated from actually happening to paper. So I think in those instances, it can be a great tool just for backup information. What kind of consequences can this have for our democracy? I think it just shows the underbelly of America. Nobody really wants to address the fact that we are breeding people that are power hungry and dangerous. Just something that was alluded to earlier is the human behavior. Do we have a human inclination to kill? I think if we do, it's because of what we're taught through media, through what we're taught in classroom, through all of these different type of things. So I think the only way it could threaten our democracy is just showing that underbelly and things that we try to not confront ever. So other than that, I think it's a great thing.
As the young lady mentioned, when people with cameras are getting in the way of the police doing their job, they need to put down their cameras and get out of the way. Other than that, I certainly don't see a problem with people taking images and videos of the police in action, because it exposes the violence not only ostensibly being committed by the police, but also the violence being committed by the community. The community that you may not see throwing rocks, bottles, Molotov cocktails, hitting at the police, spitting at the police. It also shows this. So it works both ways. It works for an abuse of authority by the police and abuse of the law by the citizenry. So I encourage it, except, and again, there's another part of this. There are a number of notorious internet websites, so-called internet news magazines that are anti-police. A couple that come to mind are Coppola, Raw Story, Crooks and Liars, that are all too happy and all too ready. Oh, and by the way, CNN and MSNBC, all too ready to get down the police. So often what will happen is some well-meaning individual will be out there with his iPhone, and he's taking pictures of a police confrontation. And he says, oh, this is going to be worth a lot. And he's got himself a nice confrontation where it looks like the police are beating some poor guy to death. He turns over that part of the video to CNN, MSNBC, whoever's going to pay the biggest buck. Only come to find out that another person who took the same video took a little bit more of it, the part where the guy was coming after the police with a chainsaw. So, so far as consequences for our democracy, I don't see that. Cameras are ubiquitous. Everybody's got one, like an opinion. So I don't see a problem. As long as, if they're going to be used against the police or against a citizen, all of the information has to be there. All of the evidence, not just a little bit of evidence. Not just, look at the police beating up on this poor innocent man who's never done anything in his entire life except raise babies, go to church. Whereas, what's not shown is this man is not so innocent, and he's attacking the police with a knife, and he's trying to hurt them. You got to show everything. That's all I have.
Well, I view the citizens taking their movies with their cell phones and movie cameras and what have you as having absolutely zero effect on democracy as such. Don't forget, we didn't even have cars when this democracy was established. And today, every household's got 2 or 3, it seems like. So, there's always something new out there. The way I see it, thinking like a police officer would, is that would be just fine. If they're standing on their porch and they're taking shots of a police confrontation, that's evidence. And if the cops recognize that that's what's going on, I'll guarantee you that that cell phone video or CD, that's going to be subpoenaed into court if he didn't take it right then. We do have an incident in Akron where a police officer was a jerk and took it away from the party that was recording it. But that's evidence, and it just goes on to show one other little tiny piece of the overall action, so to speak. It's just like all this stuff you see, girl fights and stuff on the YouTube. People put stuff on YouTube. I can't believe they put it on there. I mean, this is evidence against them, you see? And that's kind of how the cops look at it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's absolutely no effect on democracy. It may worry some people, but no effect.
I would say that, citizens should, of course, be allowed to videotape and record what's happening with the police. And I think, for one thing, it creates accountability, which I think is really, really crucial for things like police departments, which are so lacking in their punishment for officers who do abuse power. And I think while these videos can also kind of spread a lot of false information, they also educate a lot of people, and by educating people, they create more accountability for the officers, and thus, I think, change that will strengthen the community and the democracy. And I would disagree with these two gentlemen, because I think it does affect the democracy in our community, because I think, especially with my generation, I see that a lot of people aren't necessarily as politically aware as they might have been in, like, May 4th, 1970. And I think by recording things like this, people recognize then the injustices that are in our society, and it makes them want to take action, and it makes them want to fight for change.
It's a good question for the ACLU. We've represented all kinds of people here in Ohio and nationwide on this very question as to whether they had a right to film the police in action. And, I haven't done a ton of extensive research on this, but from what I can tell, there hasn't been a court yet that said that you can't do it, that indeed you have a First Amendment right to do this. I also find it ironic. I mentioned I work on a lot of privacy issues and everything these days, and the answer from government is always, what do you have to hide? If you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't have to worry about us collecting this information about you. So it's kind of ironic to see it turned on its head, because there are police departments and individual police officers out there that don't want people filming them. And I would second what our law enforcement representatives have said. It's most useful for everybody involved to film as much as possible, because you don't want situations being jeopardized or court cases by having partial footage. I've had over the years many people come to the ACLU for whatever reason. A lot of times they land on my desk, and they just want some practical advice about how to do a public protest. Whether it's a march or whether it's something in the park or out on the college campus. And one of the things I always tell them is tape or film the entire thing from start to finish. Even if you don't turn the cameras on, once things start to go south, if indeed that happens. You want a full video footage of everything that went on. From, if the police aren't there, but they arrive and things start to happen, you want that all on tape. But what you don't want to have is a situation where you have one side saying, no, the police were using excessive force and they had no business doing that, when in fact you're going to have those situations where the guy's coming after the police officer with a chainsaw. So if you can film as much as absolutely possible on this, you help do away with some of those questions and those variables.
And then our closing scripted question is, a common piece of conventional wisdom holds that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. How might this apply to the increasing militarization of police forces in the United States? And do you feel that current training standards might avoid any problems related to unnecessary, possibly forceful uses of new technology?
Even if you assume that you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, it doesn't mean you're going to smash every nail you see. So it kind of plays in that idea of, how much can you use your power and how much do you use? I mean, it's like saying, because somebody has a gun, everybody looks like a target, which that's not true either. So, it's a saying. I don't think it can apply to everything. So in some cases, yeah, people go out and they go, I have this power, I'm going to use it. Everyone is a suspect. And I don't think that can stand true for everything. And in some cases, people act that way, but in other cases, they don't. So it's a case-by-case situation where you can apply these things. And then current training standards to avoid problems. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the current English, I got this. The current training standards are, but you could always go back and revise things. Everything could be looked at twice. It's like writing your English papers. We all type it up and then submit it, but none of us, double checks it or triple checks it when we really probably should have. So, revising what our current training standards are, we could revise them now and then a month find that there's something even better. We could always find better ways to do things. So, just because you have a hammer and you think everything's a nail, doesn't mean you need to know, you need to hit it. It means you need to know which nails to hit and which ones not to.
As far as the increasing militarization, I don't know that it has increased particularly. I just think there's more attention shown on it, and that's like a hot button issue right now, so it's being talked about a lot. I don't know statistically if it has increased, so we should light on that particularly. And even training standards, I'm not sure what the training standards are. I think, as she said earlier, they could definitely be revised, and we should always be, as people, a part of America and as a part of our community, we should always question and critique our environment so they can be better. Especially as young people, it's our duty to shape what our future and what the future for our kids will look like. So I hope and pray that we are all being active in that process and always pushing for a greater change so we can have the America that we want for ourselves. You guys have done a great job, but we can always add something new, fresh, something that applies directly to our American experience in that, as far as policy and things like that go. But I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is just bridging the gap between our community and our police forces. We need to work on that, becoming communities in a holistic way, and not just having people that are walking around that everyone's afraid of and try to avoid. Is actually having real things in place where we are bridging that gap and creating, situations where I know this police officer by name, I know his family, I know or her family, and we have a relationship outside of this dynamic that has been set for us. I think that would be the biggest, the most effective way to kind of decrease the militarization that we're seeing right now.
What they said, and in addition, the increased militarization, the term militarization of the police forces has its origins in the wisdom of CNN. The fact is, after any conflict, the Pentagon is left with all sorts of tools and equipment. After the Korean War, they had equipment. After the Vietnam War, everybody was getting helicopters after the Vietnam War. And so now after the Iraq conflict is over, and now Afghanistan is over, troops are coming home, there's going to be more equipment available. you have to remember, police departments don't pay huge money for these things. I mean, if a chief of a 25-man department can get a tank for $25, who's going to say no? Why would you say no? Who doesn't want a tank? Right? But after a short period of time, you're going to learn that they're expensive to run. And there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to have one. So what do? You park it in the courthouse square and say, look, everybody, here's a tank. And you put a little plaque on it, tank. So, I watched on television, I watched the Ferguson situation, I watched the riots and everything else. And I have to tell you that I thought that some of the equipment was just a little bit over the line. But then again, I put myself in the shoes of these officers and thought, now, would I rather be walking up the street facing a bunch of people that don't like me because something's bad happened in their neighborhood, and rightfully so, they have an issue, and they're throwing things at me and Molotov cocktails and rocks and bottles and all kinds of stuff? Would I rather be doing that, or would I rather be sitting in the relative safety of armored personnel? It's like a common sense thing, but it does give an impression of an excessive demonstration of force, if nothing else. But is that in and of itself effective? It's the same officer presence thing. Oh, gee, whoa, wait a minute. These guys have tanks. Wait, we probably should back off. They have a tank. This could be seriously bad. I don't know. So far as training, I don't know how you train to drive a tank unless you go to tank school. I don't know many law enforcement agencies that will send their people to tank school. So I don't know the answer to that question. Obviously, anytime there's new technology, we need training to use it properly. Because there are so many things that can be abused. And you talk about firearms training. You have to have firearms training, and you have to have a lot of it. Because that weapon that you're carrying on your hip can kill people. So, the same thing. That's technology, too. We're no longer using bows and arrows. Thank you.
Well, everything they said. This business of military equipment, it goes back a long, long way. There was a time I seen in the Columbus Police Department a photo of two police officers going down the road in a Model T, and there was two Browning automatic rifles in their hands. I think it was probably during the Prohibition. Well, that's machine guns. Yeah, it wasn't very practical, so it went on its way. They probably sold them and turned that money into something else. Maybe they sold them with Bonnie and Clyde, I don't know. But anyway, like he said, everything, after every war, this stuff is available. But right here locally, you have a police chief that's really popular out in Brimfield. Chief Oliver. He had a really ugly incident out there a few years back, and he was really ill-equipped. By that I mean ill-equipped with the hardware. He had some brave officers. A guy took a KSU student hostage. That hostage wound up dying. Some of you may remember that. And today, Chief Oliver has a bomb-proof, bulletproof vehicle that will allow him to get right into a situation that's ever encountered before. However, I don't, like he said, I don't expect that to last because it'll get terribly expensive to maintain. But what I do expect is I expect you'll see night surveillance devices and things of that nature. But that stuff comes from the government, pretty much free, and they use it for as long as they can. And they'll probably loan it to other departments, and it's a good publicity thing. And frankly, when I look around here and walk around the campus of Kent State University, I don't ever expect to go back to some other things. To see one of these students being thrown on the ground by a police officer and kicked in the ribs. But there are bad people out there. Trust me. They are really seriously bad homicidal maniacs not too far from here. So those people will get the attention of the police agencies, and sometimes it's pretty brutal. Always keep that in mind. we have little incidences around here, and we were talking, just to regress one little bit, with regards to surveillance and that kind of thing, and citizens with cameras. When they had the May Day down here, down the street, not too far from here, well, the police got criticized the very first day because they moved in with squads and took charge of a dangerous situation and got people removed by ambulances and everything. But some thinking soul also shot pictures of students too drunk to get off of the curb, and guys fighting amongst each other with a club and things like that. I don't know what it all was anymore, but the fact was, it records everything. And these things will always be there to provide evidence and things of that nature to assist the police in getting things done. Yeah, helicopters, I guess Cleveland's still got a couple of them, but not really very useful. It's the cop on the street that gets the job done.
I think as far as the militarization of the police goes, I think that whenever you have an increase in kind of power of that kind of nature, you're going to have people who kind of, I think, run with that power and kind of use it as they please. I think in a lot of ways almost with no consequences as well. So I think in order to fix this, we kind of, I think it's very much a matter of education and creating accountability. So I think that in addition to kind of just giving people like firearms training and things like that, I think that you really have to show them what will happen if they violate certain ethics and morals of their job, which I think would be, trying not to kill people under any circumstance, unless it's like extreme and things of that nature. So, I think just educating and creating programs and workshops for officers, I think would be really helpful.
When police militarization became a recent topic, once again, mostly related to Ferguson, I made the mistake of talking to the media oftentimes about this, and I corrected myself after a few different interviews, because everybody likes to think of police militarization as the police got a big, bad, scary piece of equipment. That's police militarization. Well, that's part of police militarization. I'm going to be a bad panelist here and say that the ACLU, our national office, put out a report on police militarization back in the summer. I'm going to be a bad panelist because I can't remember what it's called, but you can find it online. And it talks, what we did when we do this often enough with different issues and subjects, we send out public records requests to police departments and law enforcement agencies around the entire country. And we ask for documents and video and whatever the policies, whatever they can give us about how they conduct their work and how they deploy certain equipment and how often. And so the report's really divided into, for instance, we talk about the use of SWAT teams. SWAT teams, there used to be a time where there weren't SWAT teams. They were sold to the general public because they, their tactics go above and beyond what at the time we thought of as traditional policing. We're going to use them in these certain circumstances and these certain situations. Well, now they use SWAT teams for all kinds of things, and what we've seen is what we like to call mission creep. That is, it's sort of like the hammer-nail problem, in that once this type of technology or policy or thinking gets introduced into the equation, starts to undergo mission creep, and we start to see sometimes things spiral out of control. So sometimes it's SWAT teams, sometimes it's, I live in Columbus now, I don't know why, but Ohio State University has a mine-resistant vehicle, this big giant thing, and nobody can quite figure out why, except who turns down free stuff. And this is coming for free from the government. They don't own it, they actually lease it from the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, whoever's providing it. In most of the contracts that the law enforcement signs, there's actually a requirement that it be used within a year or two. And what we're finding is, you got these police departments that use them for flood situations and they use them for a variety of other things. Which really, ECOU really doesn't care if you're using a mine-resistant vehicle to go get the person who's trapped in their car in a flood. But we do get worried when we see this increased ongoing militarization of police only going in one direction over the years and the decades, while at the same time crime keeps dropping. For years it's been dropping. This is the government's own statistics, Department of Justice statistics, where across the board, it's my turn to pick on CNN and MSNBC. The whole the leads and everything, but crime is dropping. And I say this to people, they say, "Oh, you're full of it." Look, the statistics are out there. You can go look them up. This is not like an anomaly of just 1 year. This is a trend over time. So what are we doing? We've got a country that incarcerates more people than anywhere else in the world. Police getting further militarized, in a society that's safer and safer. Something's very much out of whack and out of balance with this. And what we don't want is, I think, the police getting so militarized with certain equipment and certain ways of thinking. Because part of our report is we uncover some of the training manuals and the documents that are used in some of these departments. Not a whole bunch, but at least some of them. It's very concerning, the language they use, where it almost becomes a sort of warfare, us versus them mentality. You can't have that kind of thing getting into policing either. What you want is an effective police department for all people involved, the police and the citizens. So I'll just leave it with that and say, don't think of militarization as just getting that big fancy vehicle that a lot of people think really cool. Looks really cool. There's a lot of other aspects that go into police becoming more militarized over time.
Thank you very much for, yes, Mr. Snyder.
You know, I just want to comment on those of you here. Don't go ride with the Kent Police Department, or Portage County SO, or some of these places. If you ever get a chance and you can convince them to let you do it, and they do it all the time, try to get a ride along with the Cleveland Police Department, 5th District, the Akron Police Department, downtown area on a Friday or Saturday night sometime, so you can get an idea of the kinds of things that the police are continually confronted with. And they'll protect you, they won't let you get hurt, that kind of thing. But to reiterate what he's talking about with regard to crime, yeah, I think he's probably absolutely right. I didn't check it myself, but 30, 40 years ago, when you took a prisoner to the penitentiary, he went down to what they called the OP, the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. And if you're really nasty and mean, they generally kept you there. They might send you out to prison farm or somewhere like that if you weren't too violent. But if you were a murderer and you killed your friends, relatives, or acquaintances, they'd let you work on the governor's mansion. Because, as you laugh about this, but homicide people made the best probation or parole candidates there was, because they generally never committed those crimes again. And they were generally upstanding citizens until they lost their temper and killed their wife, their girlfriend, or something like that. So now, it seems like every time I turn a corner, if I'm driving down through southern Ohio or somewhere, there's a prison down there with barbed wire around. And then we got a prison for really bad guys, then we have a prison for not so bad guys, then we got a prison for other guys, and then we got this prison for those kind of people. So I don't know how many we have, do you?
We have here in Ohio a prison system that's designed for, I forget the exact figures, somewhere around 37,000. It currently holds about 51,000. We are about at an all-time high in this state for our prison population. And just since I have the mic and you asked, I'll tell you, actually the statistics have gotten a little bit better. I'm used to giving this sort of stunt speech and statistics from a few years ago when we were working on criminal justice bills in the legislature. But as of a few years ago, again, the statistics have gotten a little better on this. But as of a few years ago, half of the people we throw in prison in Ohio, half of them are out in a year or less. Half of those people do 6 months or less. Meanwhile, we have this big, overcrowded, burdensome, very expensive prison system, but it tells you something about a whole other panel, Dylan, I'll come back for it, about who we incarcerate and why in this society. And I would say, look, when half of the people you're throwing in get out in a year or less, and half of them get out in 6 months or less, you're throwing the wrong people in prison.
And just to add to that, a friend of mine, Judge Inlow, some of you may know him here in this county, he's about to retire. The cops refer to him as "let him go Inlow." But the truth of the matter is, everybody that comes before him for sentencing, they have to meet a certain criteria to go to the penitentiary. In the penitentiary, even if they meet that criteria, the penitentiary system has to tell them whether they have room for it. If they don't have room for him, he has to put him on probation. So that's the kind of stuff we're faced with these days in the criminal justice system.
Thank you all very much for your responses. We are going to take a couple of questions from the floor. So we will have someone coming around the microphone. Does anyone have any questions? The person with the microphone will select who is asking questions.
What's it? Okay, now this question might be a bit of a mouthful, so I ask that you bear with me. According to a New York Times article, June 28th from 2005, plus 3 separate court cases, such as Holzer versus City of San Jose, in 1975, Warren versus District of Columbia in 1981, and DeShaney versus Winnebago County of Social Services in 1989. According to these four separate examples, the courts ruled that, technically speaking, police have no constitutional obligation whatsoever to protect the citizens. What's your perspective on that, on those court rulings?
Is this for a specific member or for the entire panel?
Just for the entire panel.
If you want to go down the line, we would appreciate your expedience in this answer just so we can get through a number of audience questions.
I actually am familiar kind of with that a bit, that the way it is, technically they don't have any right to look after us when it comes to situations. It's expected that, protect and serve and that kind of stuff and look after the general population, but if they're in a situation where they perceive the danger could turn on them, they don't have to take action. And in some cases, I find that kind of ridiculous because, what the heck are you there for? I mean, you're the one armed, I'm not most of the time. So, personally, when I think about it, I go, that's a little bit scary. But, I usually, as far as I know, I've had good understanding with cops, and I've been in areas like here on campus where, I talk to police forces, and you know what? Most of them, when you talk to them, they go, you know what? They're there to help us and look after us. So even if, they legally say that, it's not in their job to do so, most of them, as far as I know, we're going to do that. They're going to look after us.
It was actually very shocking to hear. I didn't know it was like a constitutional thing. It's not a constitutional. That's troubling. I think we should look at that. As far as interactions with the police officer, I think we've had 2 completely different experiences with police officers. I've actually never had an experience with an officer where they were actually cooperative and willing to hear what I had to say, which could be for a couple of reasons. But that's troubling to hear. I don't have a response really to that. Maybe we should have moved our Constitution.
Actually, I knew that the police didn't have a constitutional obligation to protect and serve. You have to remember, it's a job. This goes back to Sir Robert Peel, who formed the police department, the first major police department in England, which is the London Metropolitan Police. There's August Bulmer, who's the father of police, and this is just a job. It started out as watchmen, and it started out as runners, and there were runners first, but then watchmen, and then this just evolved over the decades into what we have today. It's a job. Your job is to protect, your job is to serve, and do it as best you can.
I agree that there's no constitutional right to the police, but it's evolved kind of like the fire department. There's no constitutional right to having a fire department. When fire departments were first organized, they did so to protect the merchants, and the merchants would pay them a fee, and they would put a number or some kind of a symbol on their door, and if they had a fire, the fire department would get the horses out and hook them up in the tank, and they'd run down there, and if they had that symbol on the door, they'd try to put the fire out. Now that's simplistic, but there's a lot more involved in that. But I think it's the same with police. We hire security guards to protect our various things that are valuable. And all of that is legal. There's a long history of legal stuff, rulings out there that allow all of this to happen. Many people get very strange ideas about constitutional rights. I don't quite know how to expand on that except to say read the Constitution. And if we didn't have the police out there, we'd have everybody out here running around with their right to bear arms with a pistol in their back pocket. We still have a lot of people out there who play that way, but fortunately, not everybody.
I definitely think, I didn't know that it was not like in the Constitution that they have to protect us or serve us. But, and I think that is scary, and I think that we definitely should re-examine that, but at the same time, I definitely think that there is a moral code among police that they do realize that they should protect and serve us. And I think it is more of an unspoken thing than it is spoken, but that isn't to say that it shouldn't be spoken.
It's, I certainly know that there is no legal obligation for police to enforce the law or to protect us. And of course, a lot of us find that very unsettling. It seems to go against common sense, but I'll be a devil's advocate. Police have an awful lot of discretion as to what laws they enforce. Prosecutors have discretion as to what cases they pursue, what they don't pursue, and who they convict. And when the system is working the right way, that's a good thing. I think the problem is with some departments and some police and prosecutors, and what have you, is you simply have too many unsolved crimes, minor crimes, major crimes. The police can't do everything. They can't respond to every, in the bigger departments, they can't respond to every call right away. They have to, I turned into one of those people for a little while when I discovered on my phone that I could download Police Scanner and sit around, falling asleep listening to the Columbus Police Department dispatch and everything. And you can constantly hear them on a busy night rerouting calls and redoing how they do things. You'll hear the dispatcher sometimes say, yeah, it's been about an hour for that call over here, but the officer was responding to a much more serious situation. All of which is to say, it could be, if you want to take it to the extreme, that the logic is if we want to fix this problem of there being no legal obligation of police to protect us and they have to enforce the law all the time, well, does that mean that every time they see a jaywalking incident or every time they see some minor level of crime, they must respond? I think we need to find a nice equilibrium without requiring, absolutely one or the other. And, police do exist to protect and serve us by and large, but they do have that discretion, and it's I'm not aware of the court cases that come up and establish these guidelines and parameters. Many times they're horrible stories. I sit there and say, geez, I really wish the police would have followed up on that. But oftentimes it's a question of resources. It's that discretion that police traditionally have, and if we can't have police out there handling every single call, incident, what have you, that's going on within a timely manner, does that mean that they should be sued as a result? It's a very tricky area of law and policy, and hopefully that's some food for thought.
We will take 2 more questions from the floor. A quick note of housekeeping: if anyone is here for the Student Success Series and does need to leave, we do have the slips for that in the back by the t-shirts. Next question.
My question is in regards to the discretion and how militarization has been used. And I'd like to just bring up 2 cases. One is the Cliven Bundy case, where police were having 50 millimeter weapons pointed at them. They were in direct contact with a group of people who were hostile, yet there were no incidents of shooting, no incidents of problems whatsoever. And I'd like to juxtapose that case to one that we have here in Ohio, which is the John Crawford case in the Dayton Walmart, where an African-American man had bought a BB gun and was fatally shot for having that BB gun, not aiming it at a police officer, not pointing it, or acting in any threatening way. Do you think that that may have some impact on our perception of the choice that police and law enforcement use and the discretion that they use in their exacting of force? And I'll ask that for the panel as well.
Well, personally, I'm not familiar in detail with these cases. I can tell you what I know from reading general stuff about them, but I can't give you exact details on a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of it is how we're looking at things. I mean, and my entire major is based around handling conflicts, and preferably in a nonviolent way. And the fact is, a lot of times, people aren't taught how to do things nonviolently. As an RA, I was taught that the police here on campus would have learned verbal judo, which is how I was taught to handle situations with residents. That's a technique where no matter what somebody is saying or doing, you try and get your point. You'll notice it a lot if an officer ever pulls you over, that, I understand that, but I still need to see your license and registration. I understand that, but I need your ID. I get that, I understand, but I still need this. It's circling what they're saying back. And a lot of times we don't look at those techniques to use them. Nowadays, we jump to the idea that, well, we need to do something more forceful, we need to take action, I mean, we have paranoia and people, think they need to have weapons all the time. I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, in some cases, to be prepared for situations, but we need to look at things non-violently and be able to respond in that sense. So, yeah, back then when you had the original case, people didn't automatically assume that you had to, use a violent response to things. We looked at different ways to do it. Nowadays, we assume the best way to handle something is a physical confrontation.
Well, I'm not familiar with the first case you mentioned, but I am very familiar with the John Crawford case. What was the case?
Clive and Bundy.
Clive and Bundy?
Clive and Bundy, who basically, he basically broke the law, broke federal law. Did it actively, by feeding his cattle on federal land. When the federal police came to arrest him, he had a group of supporters who were all armed to the teeth, and pointed their arms at the federal police, who chose to wait it out because, in my opinion, they were dealing with a group of white protesters who were conservative, But when it's African Americans who are perceived as liberal or whatever, as a threat, the immediate response is shoot them, take them down. Black life isn't important, white life is, so we'll hold out. And this is my point, is that we have these perceptions for a reason, because they occur. And what I'm asking is, what's the difference? So why is it acceptable for our white citizenry to come into Walmart or Circle K with weapons, loaded weapons, oftentimes, yet they are not taken down in the way that African Americans are taken down in their community? That's what I'm asking.
I don't think it's fair. As far as the John Crawford case, and I'll look up the Clive and Bundy case because things like this are important to me. As far as the John Crawford case, I feel like that was handled completely irresponsibly, and I think it's a direct reaction to the black person, especially the black male in America, especially right now. There's a tension going through the country right now that a lot of us have the privilege. We talk about white privilege. We didn't talk about that today, but we can if you guys would like to stick around. Have the privilege to turn their eye to not acknowledge is a thing, and to not acknowledge the fact that there's a war on the black body, period, in America. We talk about Ferguson, and it was talked about earlier, and I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but I think this is important for us to bring up and put on the table, especially if we're talking about racial profiling. we talked about Ferguson and we talked about it in the aspect of these people rioting and the reaction to Michael Brown getting shot. And a lot of white people don't understand that reaction. Some black people don't understand that reaction. Let me explain it in short for you. We had Trayvon Martin happen, and we had this incident where a young man was shot, not by the police, but that's another story. And we went through the judicial system completely, from start to finish. We brought in Al Sharpton, who was mentioned earlier. We brought in Reverend Jesse Jackson, who are supposed to be our spearheads and supposed to lead us to some type of racial liberation. We did that entire process. The president made a statement on it. And in the end, we see a not guilty, and we see George Zimmerman walk off and start selling paintings for $250,000. And that's okay. And that's just where we are in America right now. And then we have Michael Brown happen, and the people say, forget the system. I think something that happened that we need to acknowledge is the fact that the people in Ferguson realized that America and the police force that is in Ferguson at the time and that came into Ferguson once they called the National Guard and whoever else they called was not there to protect them, is not there to protect them. And the system that's in place is not for them. So as far as the militarization and as far as the John Crawford shooting, I think that's a correlation of a lot of situations that we're seeing right now. There's a war on the black body. That's a strong statement, but it's a true one. And we have to engage that conversation. We have to ask those questions, but listen to the response. We can't have someone say something like, the system is against us, and just be like, no, and try to always combat that answer. We have to engage that and try to understand where that person is coming from. Because when I said my experience with the police is not like hers, I meant that completely. Because I don't get to talk to the police. I say anything, I'm being aggressive. I get put in the front seat of the cop car and then told, go about your business. I get stopped and then taken all the way to the jailhouse and let out on bail, go to court, and they're told, actually, we're not going to proceed with this case. So there's something going on, and I would like for us to, we don't have time now, but to really put our thumb on it in our personal, whatever we do after this, because that's important. And that case is important, and I promise I will look that up and definitely delve into that further.
These are very good responses, but we would appreciate if you will be brief in them, and we are going to go all the way through the panel very quickly. So you'd like to continue?
The Clive Bundy case was not a matter of Mr. Bundy breaking the law. The fact is, he was grazing his cattle on government land. He'd been doing so for dozens of years. His family had been doing that for hundreds of years. And the government had given him warning after warning after warning and told him, we're not going to do that. You can't do that. You've got to pay us. You've got to pay us. Well, Mr. Bundy decided that he was better than the United States government because he was a rancher, therefore he shouldn't have to pay. So the government Bureau of Land Management agents came along, and their whole job was to remove his cattle. And so out came Mr. Bundy's Nevada militia. Yes, they pointed guns at the Bureau of Land Management and at federal officers, and the decision was made in Washington. Are we really going to get into a shooting war over a bunch of cattle, or should we just let the courts do what the courts do best, which is take care of the years to resolve it? So that's the situation with Clive and Bundy. I'm not going to comment on the Walmart situation because although I'm familiar with it peripherally, I don't know enough about the case to comment. I don't know all the evidence, but I reject out of hand that the police simply walked into Walmart, saw a black man with a gun, and shot him. I just reject that.
So cattle is okay, but a BB gun, that's unacceptable.
Okay, I've seen BB guns, pellet rifles that resemble AR-15s. So I don't know. I'm not going to comment on that case. I just don't know enough about it.
Well, I think the response has been good so far, but I do want to say this. First of all, don't know much about either one of those cases, except what I read. I agree completely with him with regard to the Bundy case. It was a civil matter, actually. Except I never heard of a 50-millimeter gun that the government had.
No, the government didn't have it. Bundy's camp had it. And my point is that they were breaking the law by pointing their weapons at officers, but that was acceptable for them. Had it been black men,
it must have been
pointing
rifles
50,
or something.
50
They didn't
caliber
have
weapons.
anything with a 50 Now, I've never
Regardless of the fact of what they had or didn't have, it's more of a principal question. If we could proceed in that.
with regard to the Walmart case, I don't know what happened down there, but I do know that they make pellet guns and BB guns that look like 45s and everything else. And I have no idea what was on the officer's mind, but eventually he'll get shook out in court because it's on videotape, I guess. Is that right? Stuff happens, and that's one of those instances.
Stuff happens to black people a lot in this country.
Well, let's not forget, stuff also happens to white people. There are more white people killed by police in any given year than there are black people.
There's more white people than American people.
Well, actually, black people commit more crime, but I'm not going to go into
There are people of all races that are killed, so we're going to proceed to Ashley. Everybody dies, so let's go to
Look at the
Ashley.
FBI website. Look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This isn't a reflection.
I'm going to have to cut you off. We're running over time.
I'm just gonna say that I honestly completely agree with Matthew. Yeah, I honestly completely agree with him, and I don't really have that much to add to that. So
I'm always cautious of using two distinct situations and trying to compare them and find differences and similarities. That said, I wonder myself what would have happened if those would have been black faces in Nevada when that was tried. A lot of the Second Amendment folks talk an awful lot about the right to bear arms and concealed carry and open carry, but it seems like to a person they all freak out when the new Black Panther Party goes around wearing guns out in the open. Then all these Second Amendment advocates don't become such Second Amendment advocates anymore. We have a larger problem, black and white, with government response to a lot of this stuff. I mean, I was thinking of some federal issues where things, in my opinion, went way overboard and never should have reached that. You look at Waco and the Branch Davidians and the government's response to that. Around the same time where you had Randy Weaver, who was accused of selling an illegally sawed-off shotgun, I believe, and they shot, I think it was not only him, but his dog and another member of the family or two. That was their response to it. When it was black folks in Operation Move in Philadelphia in the 1980s, they didn't stand down like they did in Nevada. They bombed the entire neighborhood and killed people. So I always have to wonder, and it's part and parcel, I think, of my ideology and also who I work for. But, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I joke around. I used to drive a minivan around, and I would pull a U-turn in the middle of the street. I will deny saying that, but I'd do something like pull a U-turn in the middle of the street. I'd have a coworker in the car, and they'd say, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" I said, "Look, I'm a middle-aged white guy in a suit and a minivan. I'm invisible to law enforcement. They didn't see that." But I know it's not the same for an awful lot of other people out there, and I think that's what your question is getting. I mean, this guy in Beaver Creek, he had a product that was sold at the store that he picked up. You had, apparently, from what I've heard, the person calling in saying you've got an active shooter in Walmart, and you had the police come in guns a-blazing. I have to think, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know how it's all going to shake out, but I have to think in a lot of situations that would have ended up differently. We weren't talking about a black man, but we were talking about a white guy in the same situation.
We do have to end now. We are out of time. I would like to thank all of our panelists and remind you that this discussion is definitely not over, and encourage you to interact with all of these people. Tori can be found through Student Peace Alliance, Matthew through Black United Students, Mr. Scott teaches a class at this campus, and Ron Snyder works here on campus. Ashley, of course, can be found through the May 4th Task Force, and Mr. Gary Daniels can be found through the ACLU. So I encourage you, please contact all of these people if you have more questions. This debate will never be over. So keep talking, keep asking questions, and thank you very much to our panelists. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, guys, for being here. Good job. See you on Monday next week.